right. Hello, and welcome to Stable Discussion.
Hey everyone. Hey Ben. How's it
Hey,
going?
hey, how's it going? Oh,
Pretty.
you're asking me first this time. All right.
Yeah, I try to beat you to it this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, things are going really well. We had a pretty fun event in Toronto here with OpenAI, which is really cool. So we gotta learn about some of the cool stuff there. Meet a bunch of people that were interested in AI too. So that was pretty fun.
Yeah, that's very
Um,
exciting.
so Yeah, that happened this week. The sun's also out. It's starting to get to be summery again. Very,
Nice.
very good.
Mm, I know. That's all. That's all I care about. I turn into a different person every summer. Every summer,
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
feel like I frolic. I embody frolicking, and I put that into the world. In fact, I literally
Yeah.
frolic. In fact, I've been going dancing. Right, like by myself. Like the last
Hmm.
few weekends, I've just gone out. I found a random dive bar or something and look for a theme night I'm into. For example, tonight I'm going to go for the first time, not by myself. I'm going with a friend.
Hmm.
Dancing. I'm going to go into a 90s/2000s themed dance party in the back of a dive bar.
Oh,
It's gonna be a
fantastic.
great time. Fantastic. It's always a
That's
summer
gonna be
vibe for
awesome.
me. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, and it's definitely that season for everyone to get out and mingle. And I think it's definitely been pretty awesome to see people in the real world talking about AI a bit more. So
Oh yeah.
um,
And this is I think very pertinent to the topic at hand.
mhm,
Um, so today's podcast topic, we want to talk about something we've been kind of avoiding getting too deep into, but I think
mhm,
it's worth us talking about and sharing some of our thoughts.
mhm,
Sort of the ethical ramifications of AI. Let's call it that.
mhm, mhm,
It's a very complicated topic, and there's a lot of strong feelings about this, and
mhm,
it's worth talking about. I think that there's tons of interesting angles we can come up at it from. I did get
mhm,
another outline, and I shared it with Ben that we're going to go over today.
mhm. Yep.
So again, we won't follow it perfectly, but I do like that we could probably have some guidance here.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so
Hey.
that's gonna be fun. What do you feel about
Mhm.
ethics and AI, Ben?
Yeah, I think it's a big scary topic that sends shivers down my spine. But I also think it's a pretty awesome topic. I'm definitely like a humanist. I
Mm,
believe that like people are important for good work to happen. I don't think that you can really replace a lot of that with systems or AI. Um, so I think it is something that's core, but I also think it's something that is very divisive and a bit of a challenge to kind of talk through. So.
we'll
So I'm
get
excited
into it.
to I'm excited to jump into it. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's gonna
yeah.
be great.
So that outline is says a half an hour for the first part, which is a news catch up.
Mhm,
But honestly, I don't want to spend much time on it. We'll cut it
mhm,
down to something shorter because I think
mhm,
we can talk a lot about the ethical part of this more. But let's
mhm.
start going over some interesting news of the last I don't know couple of weeks. So the one I always
Why
care
don't
about more. Oh
Yeah. Do you wanna just give us like a so we have the outline, we're gonna go jump into the news first. We're eventually gonna get
yeah,
into ethics. There was a couple other sections, right?
yeah.
Or am I misremembering? Yeah.
So let me kind of give you a quick summary of our outline. So first, we're going to talk about Google I/O. We're going to talk about some interesting things that we've seen. Like one topic that I think is really cool is something called drag GAN. And I'll mention what a GAN is because it's something we haven't seen in a while, but it's kind of coming back a bit. A great paper I read that I think people should read. It's really interesting. It's called Tree of Thoughts. The full title is something more complex. What is it? Full title
Mhm,
is Tree of Thoughts: Deliberate Problem Solving with Large Language Models. Great paper,
mhm,
and we'll share the link for that one so you guys can read through it. Um, yeah, and then kind of from there we'll go into part two, which is talking more about the ethical considerations in AI. So I want to talk about the considerations of AI in art, AI in job displacements, AI in security concerns, AI and challenges to the absolute human condition. And
mhm,
specifically, I want to call out Geoffrey Hinton, who's somebody I've brought
mhm,
up actually once or twice as somebody who I think is really interesting and relevant in the AI world because he's been making news as he's left and departed Google for particularly interesting reasons tied to ethics. He's kind of worried about AI and where it's going and
mhm,
potential ramifications that it has to human beings for a variety of reasons. And so we can talk about that because he's a big deal. So him
mhm,
talking about this and him putting that effort in there is probably going to continue to expand the let's say, the scope of discussion around this topic in the near future. So
Hmm.
yeah, and that's our day. And anything else kind of think is
Hmm.
interesting, maybe we'll toss in there. But that's our outline.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, yeah. I just think, like before, it's great that we've got it, and I'm glad that we're putting it in. And I think just for anyone new listening, this is sort of something that we've ran through ChatGPT to help us better
Yeah.
understand what we're trying to do, and better organize all the chaotic thoughts that both of us just kind of surface when it comes to AI. We kind of explode, and it's a shotgun blast of information. So it's nice to have
Yeah.
it
And we want
boxed in
to
for us.
we want to eat our own dog food. We keep talking about using AI, and so
Mhm.
where else better to use it than on our podcast where we talk about using AI? Makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Cool. So let's jump into the news.
Cool. Let me do IO because I watched it and
Mhm,
I also watched IO.
mhm,
So for those who don't know, Google IO is a yearly conference Google has where it's originally intended as a developer conference. So what that means is basically they might have a bunch of really interesting new APIs, application protocol interfaces, which are kind of ways for developers to interact with their technology. A simple example might be like Google Translate. You can go onto google.com/translate and like put in text and get it translated for you. But you can also like through just like programmatic means, just pass text to it and have it pull out for you the translated versions of that text. So that's a simple example of an API and tied to a tool that we might all know. And Google had lots of those APIs behind the scenes that they use, you know, in their products and that we have access to. So they usually talk about those things at this conference, and they talk about their new products as well too. It's become a bit of a
mhm.
product conference as well. So they talk about like their new fold phone. They talked about, um, I don't really care much for the products to be honest. There's other things they talk about, the tablet, etc. I was really paying attention to the AI though, because this year Google really, really kind of ramped up the discussion about AI. And there's tons of stuff out there that you can read up. And I recommend if you want, just go on YouTube and look up a video, like a summary of IO AI topics. And it's 20 of them out there with kind of show you the interesting stuff there. And I'll just talk about a couple of those things that I think are relevant. And if you want more information, I recommend honestly finding tons of YouTube videos that can walk through that for you.
Mhm.
So the first thing I want to talk about is their announcement of PALM 2, PALM 2. So PALM stands for Pathways PA Language Model. And this is also sort of a bit of a confusing thing because Pathways is tied to a different effort by not Jeffrey Hinton, sorry, by Jeff Dean. Jeff Dean is like the principal
Lots of
engineer.
Jeffs.
Yeah, there's tons of Jeffs
Mhm.
in this world, by the way. So prepare yourself for that. Jeff Dean is very famous too. He's famous for a different reason. There's a lot of nerd jokes about Jeff Dean because he's very smart. He's a very smart man. He's been around at Google for a very long time, and he like leads every one of their major teams. So he's had this idea about the models of the near future that are different than the ones that we have today, and it's a very interesting topic, and I think it's very relevant for some of our interests. And then maybe I'll talk about that a little bit more, but I'll just summarize it to say that this pathways initiative he has is essentially trying to find ways to create a more scalable and distributed system for AI. Right now, with language models, especially, as they get bigger, the more challenging they get to use in some ways. Like it takes much more time to use GPT-4 than 3.5. It's a good example. If I type in
Mhm.
a string for GPT 3.5, I'll get an output in like less than 3.5 seconds, let's say. But if I do the same thing for GPT-4, I'll get a better quality output, guaranteed.
Mhm.
But it'll take 3, 4, 5 times as long. Like
Mhm.
honestly, you can take like 15 seconds sometimes to finish the whole
Mhm.
thing, or 20 seconds. And it's worth it. What's 20 seconds for an answer on how to solve a code problem? But you can see how this could be problems. For example, if you want to have a system that can scale out to your Google searches, and you want to do search, you don't want to wait 15 seconds to get your response. You want to get something back immediately. So they've been working really hard on trying to find ways to improve this system, and Palm is one of their like first initial efforts where they just trained it in very special ways. And I won't go into technical details, but Palm 2 was recently announced, and it's what's powering their Bard API. Bard is
Mhm.
their search-based chatbot, very similar to Bing's chatbot. And they talk about a lot about their advances there. They're basically having their own sort of plugin system. They talk about their partnerships with other teams. They have a partnership with Langtree, with
Mhm.
also with the company I had some experience with years ago, REPL, it's
Mhm,
REPL.IT. I use it for education purposes back in the day. I used to teach,
mhm,
and I use that as a platform for teaching.
mhm. It's my
Uh,
choice interview platform as well. Like
yeah,
I use that for
it's
interviews. Yeah.
if you're technical and you want to look into some cool ways to sort of like play with code and get some
Mhm,
back and forth feedback with other people in code in a social
mhm,
way, it's a great platform. Look into it,
mhm,
and they've now been partnered with Google, so there's some interesting stuff happening there. Um,
mhm,
so um, tons of cool stuff there, like prompts to deploying a code right away. That was something that they're working on. And Palm 2 is very interesting because it is tiny. It is tiny,
mhm,
but um, almost as good as GPT-4. Not quite. Maybe even if, and some things is almost as good, and some things is not anywhere near as good. But the
mhm,
benefit is that it is, I think it's 10 billion parameters. Now, for reference, we know that GPT 3.5 was about 150 billion parameters.
mhm,
And estimates, they don't talk about it, but estimates put GPT-4 at around 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion parameters.
mhm,
And why that's relevant is that these parameters represent this rough size, the bulkiness of a model. And
mhm,
with language models of today, their nature and all these in the transformer architecture, which we've talked about before, but transformers are this baseline kind of like architecture that's been described in 2017 from a paper called "Attention Is All You Need." Anyway, this architecture is very powerful, but the bigger it gets, the slower it gets because
mhm,
it is, let's say, quadratically expensive to use. And what that means, basically, a simple example would be um, when you pass text into a transformer or to any kind of like language model, um, what it does to complete and to provide the next output is that it first tokenizes all that text. So it breaks it into roughly 4 character batches,
mhm,
and it passes that token through every single parameter that exists in um, in the model,
mhm,
and those parameters represent kind of like the internal knowledge of the model, and from that it decides what's best to put outwards or how to understand this token. So first
mhm,
it'll tokenize all the letters you put in already, all the characters into those groups, and then it'll say, well, with information, let's put in the next character, and then so let's tokenize that entire group again and put in the next token, which is going to be maybe the word the or something like that,
mhm,
uh, and it'll put that all again back through that model. And so
mhm,
the process essentially is the bigger your prompt and the bigger the model, the more expensive this gets because for the longer the response gets, the more expensive this gets because it takes the
mhm,
bigger response or the bigger previous context that it has, puts it back
mhm,
through the entire model. It says, okay, well, now that I have added one sentence to it, let's again look at the whole output that exists so
mhm,
far, including what you prompted it with, and pass it through the model and
mhm,
pass each token of those in through each parameter. Yet another token doesn't matter.
mhm,
Scratch, we pass every single one of those tokens again through the
mhm,
model. So
mhm,
it's bigger and bigger and bigger, more expensive. Anyway, long story
mhm,
short, huge models, very powerful, but they don't scale infinitely
mhm,
well. And
mhm.
usually get faster and better, and that's going to help. But people are looking at ways to make things smaller and more refined. Uh,
And
yeah,
that does seem to be where like Google keeps positioning itself too, in terms of like this race, in terms of like what's happening. So like we saw it with the image model it did earlier, where compared to like Stable Diffusion, where you're kind of like constructing an image kind of chunk by chunk, it sort of like does this like iterative rendering in a very different way, that turns out to be like significantly faster and
yeah,
much easier at actually producing like readable text and more correct outputs. Midjourney had huge leaps in that as well, but
yeah.
I think this is another sign that like sort of Google's looking at, okay, maybe we can't play like the size game, and maybe we aren't kind of going to be first to market in that, but maybe we can be first to market in at least like optimizing or being the efficiency of these other models.
I think you're exactly right, and that's kind of what they kind of talked about here. In fact, they even have a family of models for Palm 2, the smallest of which they say isn't even 10 billion parameters. It's very small, but they say it can run on your smartphone
Mm,
offline,
mm,
which is quite powerful. It won't be anywhere near as good as GPT-4, but not might even
Mhm.
be as good as GPT-3.5. But there's something to
Mhm.
be said about having a model that can run on your device.
Mhm.
That means that you can quickly and accurately, or accurately enough.
Mhm.
That means that you have a lot of new opportunities there, tied to security,
Mhm.
if you don't want to have your
Mhm.
thing connected to a Google server, or tied to
Mhm.
functionality. If you want to have games that use language models, you don't want to have them have to hit the server every single time to run, or else it's an online only game. Well, what if you could have it
Mhm.
so that you have a little model that exists on your computer or on your phone that you can talk to, interact with, to enrich your game? I think that's going to be a increasingly powerful opportunity. I think there's other people who are working on this as well too. This is very much the effort that you see inside of the open source market. Open source
Mhm.
being, the overall community that we have around us that people contribute to. Ben recently contributed to an open source project a little while ago, which is very cool.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that we're going to see over the next year or two this really
Mhm.
this like divergent path, and they're both relevant. The one path where
Mhm.
they try to make things the most powerful, amazing, interesting models out there, and the path that's
Mhm.
trying to make them actually cheap, small, and efficient to run,
Mhm.
which will not be the best, but they'll learn from the best, and they'll
Mhm.
improve over time, and you can have them on your smartwatch or in your headphones probably in the
Mhm.
future.
And like we see this in a lot of other fields too. Like, I mean, if you look at deployment right now, if you're building an app and you're going to deploy it right now, it's like for Cell and Netlify are like the key tools that we do to do that. It's just easy. It's
Yeah,
it's a couple button presses. You hook up your library to it, just works, and then suddenly you've got an app and it's live. Um, that's just running on top of AWS. There's no magic really. There's a little bit of like kind of like making it integrated in the easy way. And I think that's sort of the magical piece. But there's really something powerful in that in this sort of space where uh, you really want to capture things for enterprise at this like large scale, can do anything, very customizable space. But then the hobbyists really end up living in a very different world. And so I think this divergence is sort of natural. We generally see this kind of come up time and time again. It just so happens that like the entire thing is open source in an earlier point that we are really used to seeing. So now there's a lot more divergence here, which is very
absolutely.
interesting.
And I think that we're going to see more and more as also people tend to explore different techniques for building
Mhm.
models.
Mhm.
Billions are being poured into this industry right now, billions upon billions upon billions, and like within the last like
Mhm.
6 months only, that
Mhm.
amount has been skyrocketing since
Mhm.
ChatGPT really, and then again when GPT-4 came out.
Mhm.
So it should be an interesting world, and I think I really do welcome all this diversity for a variety of
Mhm.
reasons. Some of them even just being ethical, in that we want to make
Mhm.
sure we have as many players as possible, so that we have all this power in one group's hands, which is
Mhm.
fascinating as well too. I mean, we can talk about that later on.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
the next thing I want to talk about real quick with IO before I leave it is that so Google recently combined their two disparate AI teams. I think I've also mentioned that they
Mhm.
have these two teams. They have Google Brain and they have DeepMind.
Mhm.
DeepMind was a purchase they made for $600 million USD. It was in pounds
Mhm.
because DeepMind's a UK company, and that was about 5 6 years ago. And that they've been working separately, more or less, from Google Brain, which is their bread and butter internal company, internal group for AI, which is very powerful. They're both very powerful groups. And if you measure their ability against like papers they both release highly qualitative, powerful papers. Like Google Brain released that Transformer paper, for example.
Mhm.
DeepMind released Chinchilla. They've released
Mhm.
Flamingo. They released tons of interesting papers tied to
Mhm.
using models of the future. So they both have like really, really powerful pedigrees, let's say. But they've often competed internally as groups. And I think after the whole thing that happened with ChatGPT and GPT-4
Mhm.
and a lot of the launches was eaten, they're like, all right, we're now combining these teams. It's going to be all
Mhm.
run by Demetrius, um,
Mhm.
who is like an idol. I think I mentioned him again also in one of these
Mhm.
podcasts. He's a child prodigy in chess who ended up going into making Theme Park the game and Black and White the game, and then
Mhm.
became a neuroscientist, and then founded
Mhm.
DeepMind. He's just a smart person.
Mhm.
So he's running this group now, and they are actually starting a new model product, and they're
Mhm.
calling it Gemini so far. It's the code name,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
They haven't released a lot about it yet. Of course, people are speculating like crazy, and I won't do that too much. But I will say that what they've said so far about it is that it is going to be multimodal out the gate,
Mm,
which generally means, for those who don't know what that means, I'll kind of do a quick recap rather. Multimodality in models is relevant because currently language models are only trained on text, meaning
mhm,
that you put in text, you get text outputs. There are some workarounds people are working on that's really clever. Like you put in text, and then that it gives you text output, but that text output can be converted into code, which can convert it into like an
mhm,
image, for example.
mhm,
And
mhm,
that was decently well, but
mhm,
the model has no idea about that image. It doesn't really know what it looks like. It just knows what the text representation is of that image at best. So there's this idea that, with all these models, especially with transformers, what's special about them is that they can tokenize anything. Tokenization I mentioned before is converting, like right now, text in groups of four characters, in English at least, in other languages it's different groups, into like machine understandable vectors, which are like numbers, which can be used inside of its brain. I won't go into details too much, but that's kind of what you should think about it as. Text and numbers. Um, you can also convert pixels to numbers in
mhm,
different groups, different
mhm,
chunks. And people do that sometimes as well, but it's expensive. Pixels and images are very heavy, and we don't have the best. Well, we don't have a lot of really good architecture that works with it, although we have some.
mhm,
Multimodality is it can take both text and images and understand them both
mhm,
equally.
mhm,
People are working on different kinds of architectures that can work with not just text and images, but sound, converted to tokens, and even things that are not traditionally things that humans understand, like LiDAR point clouds,
mhm,
or like radar information, or
mhm,
other kind of spatial like data that we don't perceive,
mhm,
or visual data we don't perceive, or auditory
mhm,
data we don't perceive, to things that you can perceive. Really interesting stuff. And they mentioned multimodality, so we don't know exactly what that means. It could be just text and pictures. It can be text, pictures,
mhm,
audio, text, picture, audio, video. It could be tons of things. Who knows?
mhm,
But they're training it. They already have a checkpoint, which means that when they train these models to be very big, they can
mhm,
basically pause them at certain points, copy it, and use a smaller version of it, and
mhm,
like a mini version of it, and test it out,
mhm,
and then they can continue to grow from that point.
mhm,
And so they have checkpoints that's already functionally multimodal, meaning that they can give it
mhm,
either an image, I'm guessing, or text, and it can output either images or text. So
mhm. Wow.
it should be very interesting to see what this turns into. It's still being trained.
Mhm,
I imagine most of these things take about, well, they're getting much faster training, but they take anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 months to train, I'd say, depending on how big you want this model to be. So who knows how long they've been training it? Who knows how long they're going to? But I'd say by end of this year, we'll probably hear more about it.
mhm,
After training, they do very thorough testing for months and months and months to make sure it isn't
mhm.
like, I don't know, say very racist stuff, or isn't like
Yeah.
really, really like dangerous.
Mhm,
Like we'll talk about the ethics of this, but it could be
mhm,
dangerous. It could be like
mhm,
malicious, maybe not the word you use, but it could
mhm,
just not care about security and just go into your computer, it has access to it, and like do very terrible
mhm,
things. Do
mhm.
RM, RF, um, all, you know,
Yeah. Delete all your files.
with all your files basically, or
Mhm.
drop all your tables in your code base just because it wants to,
Yeah.
because it's funny, who knows what.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
should be very interesting to see what goes on there. I think that's going to be sort of like the next generation of models that we see,
mhm,
not just
mhm.
this Gemini one,
Yeah.
but we'll see OpenAI. You see other companies who are working on models that are just text based, but text and image.
Mhm,
I mean, GPT-4 is multimodal, but in a very particular
mhm,
way. It's using a process that's probably called stitching. Stitching is when you combine a model that's text, let's say, and
mhm,
image.
mhm,
You freeze them so they don't change anymore, and you give them kind of a glue intermediary step, and
mhm,
bingo bango, it's multimodal. Um,
mhm,
on an image, you talk to it, the text part talks to the image part, and the image part gives you an
mhm,
output. So it's
mhm,
one cohesive piece, but the
mhm,
thing is they're not really trained from the beginning to be multimodal,
mhm, mhm,
which means that they don't really have an initial understanding of things in this multidimensional world. And a lot of
mhm,
initial research has shown that things that do have that have a lot of
mhm,
opportunities and gains from that, like a transfer of
mhm,
understanding from,
mhm,
I know what an apple looks like, and I know what
mhm.
apple statistically is made up of chemically and is like
Right.
described as. And that way, when I
Mhm,
see an apple, I'm like, oh, absolutely an apple.
mhm,
It's rotten, though. I can tell it's rotten because I know what a rotten
mhm,
apple looks like.
mhm.
That kind of stuff.
It would be interesting to, like, see that with something like poetry. or something like that,
Mm,
where like even the way that the words are written or the ways that the words look even implies something. And
absolutely.
so it's another like level of understanding that you might not have otherwise. Yeah.
It should be very fascinating. I think this is going to be.
Mhm.
I mean, this is why I love this stuff. I think that this is also
Mhm.
very insightful into the human mind in a lot of ways,
Mhm.
as we ask
Mhm.
ourselves why we do the things we do when we are kind
Mhm.
of butting up against these models that do the things they do.
Mhm.
He's like, "Oh, that's weird. Why would I do that?" I mean, like, wait, why
Mhm.
do I do that? Why do How do I do that?
Yeah.
What's my reasoning behind that? And so it's a very much
Yeah.
an interesting mirror. It's not a one-to-one mirror for
Mhm.
us. They're not
Mhm.
us, but they're the kind of
Mhm.
mirror that makes you introspect, which is very powerful, I think.
Yeah. I think one of my this is because we're going to go into Jeffrey Hinton a little bit, but in
Yeah.
one of his interviews, he talks about like hallucinations, which
Mm,
I think he prefers to call confabulations.
mm.
But it's like half truths or like misremembered details, and those are like always the hallmarks of like human conversation. I often, like, and so it's sort
Yeah,
of like these systems are sort of just doing what is human to some degree,
yeah. We don't
which is
we don't have
hilarious.
we don't have a video recording in our brains of things that have happened in our past.
Mhm.
Whenever we remember them, we are just reconstructing them from scratch based off of like
Mhm.
sound, noise in our brain. And
Mhm.
so when we remember things, and this is why often people talk about why having a witness, eyewitness, is not very useful in a lot of
Yeah.
situations because you can very easily coerce them to remember something differently. Because if you can really
Mhm.
convince them that that shirt was blue, not red, they remember it, it's going to be blue in their memory. Not because
Mhm.
they have a recording in their brain, but because they have code in their brain or signals in
Mhm.
their brain that they convert
Mhm.
into visual memories.
Yeah,
So,
and there's some evidence that like the more time you spend remembering a memory, the less well you actually recall that memory.
yeah,
So the more often you think back on a loved memory, the more it gets destroyed, which is interesting. Uh,
yeah. The more it's manipulated in the feedback loop between your memory and your recollection of it going back into
Mhm.
your database. See, this is why it's so
Right.
interesting. Like it makes us think more about how we
Yeah.
do things, right?
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
fascinating stuff and
Yeah.
worthy of its own conversation. But let's move on. Let's talk about
Yeah.
the next
Y-
thing.
Awesome. This is
Dragon.
GAN, Drag GAN. Yeah. I don't. Maybe you've seen it on LinkedIn. Maybe you've seen it on other platforms.
Why don't you talk
But there's
about it
this
and I'll share my screen and you talk about it.
awesome. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, but there's this fantastic demo Della's about to bring up, where you see like this image of a dog or image of a sunset or something like that, and you basically get these kind of like key points to be able to like manipulate. And so you can see, yeah, now on the screen here, dragging the smile bigger, changing the ears. I think there's one of these with a car further in where it kind of adjusts like yeah the details of this car, and I think that that's fantastic for something like I don't know like industrial design or something like that where you maybe want to emulate something or you want to make it look a little bit different. I think I often think back to like product managers or people who are like sort of like trying to get just the right photo or just the right output. It being able to just like kind of hop in and just kind of quickly change it a little bit. It's fantastic. There's a uh, there's a guy who I'm trying to remember. I think he's used to be a developer. Something worry. I can't remember. I'll add in the show links, but um, basically the idea is a lot of the systems that we use to build with, like if we're coding or if we're writing or a lot of things, um, if we wanted to tweak those things, there's often not like a user interface for that. Oftentimes we're like hard coding something in, and then we like switch back to the context of like where it's displayed and we're looking at it. This is like the first like almost effortless case where you basically get this user interface to change something and interact with something, and it feels somewhat effortless in that way where you can kind of easily take that output and directly in the output make those changes. Um, so this is just fantastic. I don't know. It's such a cool demo. I'm a huge like visual person, and I
Yeah.
think this stuff is going to change everything.
Yeah. I think to some degree what is really um powerful about this
Mhm.
is the same thing that's powerful about a lot of these tools that we've been building over the last year or two is that
Mhm.
It enables a wider group of people to be very capable of doing things that were normally very skilled tasks. Like shifting the perspective of a line like this, you could have maybe done
Mhm.
that if you were a Photoshop expert, like really
Mhm.
like 10,000 hours kind of an expert
Mhm.
before.
Mhm.
But what does it mean when somebody can just do this, click it around and move it
Mhm.
around? It means that you enable people to be much more powerful as individuals.
Mhm.
You can have groups of people do more as well. You can have people
Mhm.
who are not necessarily people who have 10,000 hours in Photoshop, be people who are your editors for your images and modify things for you.
Mhm.
So you create opportunity, a lot of opportunity
Mhm.
with this sort of thing.
Mhm.
And the tools are going to get better. This is still very rudimentary. The buttons are still very much
Mhm.
like um, kind of arcane to some degree to some
Yeah.
people, but
Mhm.
they'll increasingly become more clear. And just
Mhm.
for some insight, GAN, General Adversarial Networks. These were very popular before the Transformers came out. They were
Mhm.
like 5 6 years ago. They're the big deal.
Yeah, you
Oh
would see these like sketches, rough sketches of something, and then it would come into like being a massive, beautiful landscape or something like that from a simple sketch that a 3-year-old might make.
yeah, yeah, of
Mhm.
course, and
Mhm.
like they were really cool for what back then, but they were
Mhm.
replaced very quickly with like your dollies, your midjourneys, and your stable
Mhm.
diffusions.
Mhm.
So GANs are still relevant and they're still
Mhm.
powerful in a lot of ways, and
Mhm.
and they're still able to do a lot of really cool things for us. And this is a GAN based tool where you can take an
Mhm.
image and then modify it
Mhm.
with this system. And the powerful thing about it again, and the way it works is that it's really two separate tools.
Mhm.
Your like generator, let's say, and your critique, your criticizer. I forget the term for it.
Mhm.
There's more like technical terms, but the person
Mhm.
that generates or the model that generates is like, here's a picture of a cat, and then the other one's like, is it really though? Is it? It's like,
Mhm.
no, it's not cat like enough. And then so their jobs are very different. One is to generate as
Mhm.
realistic a cat as possible, and one is to
Mhm.
say whether or not they can tell that this was generated to be a cat or if it's really a cat picture. And
Mhm.
the more this feels like a real picture to the one that
Mhm.
can be the critiquer, the
Mhm.
better the reward given to the one that generates. And through this process, you create great things. So
Mhm.
yeah, and you can see when they shift this around, you can see that it's constantly doing this iterative step process to
Mhm.
kind of
Mhm.
get just right or a realistic image.
Mhm.
Anyway, it's really cool. I think we'll see more tools like this. I think we'll see tons of combinations of different kinds of models that work together to
Mhm.
create vastly more complex systems in the palm of everyone's hands, really,
Mhm.
as we've done with technology over the last,
Mhm.
well, forever, but more
Mhm.
recently with our models of the last 5 years.
Mhm. Absolutely. That was another thing in Google I/O, right? Which was the magic edit, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Capability. So,
Yeah.
like, Google's already sort of done the magic eraser. They pulled that in from sort of Photoshop, but now the magic edit, where it's like, oh, like the cropping of this photo is wrong. Let me just move you over a little bit, or like change the photo in like these magical ways. This sort of it feels like this is on the way
Yeah.
to that in some ways. That's much more rudimentary, or it's a very different process, but it's still sort of showing that same, you know, let's kind of fill in the background with what this probably has. Let's sort of, do that context aware fill, and then let's adjust this photo to be where we want.
There's I
Yeah.
think I think there's a lot of things we can talk about with the ethics, but this is one of those topics. Is what does it mean
Mhm.
when people can edit photographs so
Mhm.
easily? Before there was at least
Mhm.
that guard you to be an expert, but now anybody
Right.
can do it.
Mhm.
Relevant. But let's keep moving on. The next thing I'll talk about is the paper tree of thought.
Mhm.
So I'll do this quickly. I want to try to have at least one paper I share with everyone every single time we do this because I think it's going to be a
Mhm.
very valuable way to um, demystify the nature of these
Mhm.
things.
And last
Uh,
week we just talked about how you should everyone can kind of get in and start reading these papers. So gotta eat our own dog food here too.
yeah, exactly. So this is one I read a couple days ago, and it's funny because I was talking to my partner's father, and he had this new game he was playing where basically it's a little game on his phone where
Mhm.
he gets like 7 or 8 numbers and he has to make it equal another number.
Mhm.
And so you multiply numbers, add, subtract, and the goal is to hit the final resulting number. And I mention it because this mechanism, this let's say prompting technique that they discuss in this paper actually has one of their first tests being that exact game. It was so funny because he brought up the game for me, and I just finished reading the paper, and it's called Game 24,
Mhm.
where you say, "Great, here are four numbers
Mhm.
right there." In this case, the four numbers they're showing are numbers 4, 9, 10, and 13, and they're
Mhm.
saying make it equal a value that I tell you to, 24 specifically in this case. And they're like, "Cool, well, let's see if I do 4 plus 9, it's equal to 13. If I do 10 minus 4, it's equal to 6." And it just
Mhm.
there's all these little permutative steps to try to get to the
Mhm.
final result of 24 and give you an answer.
Mhm.
Um, and it's much better at doing so. This technique than previous
Mhm.
techniques of doing so. And I'll explain
Mhm.
real quick what I mean by this technique.
Mhm.
So
Also,
these
you wanna zoom
models,
in just a little bit on that?
oh
Just
yeah, why
so
not?
we
They're
can kinda
so
see
small.
that. Perfect.
How about that? Nice and
Yeah,
big.
nice. Perfect.
So these models are language models are very powerful at giving you answers. Like right now, if I were to use ChatGPT, I would say, "Hey, what's the answer to question X or Y?" And it would give me a response. And I think of responses almost as like a single thought. If we can think of our thoughts as these like flashes or as these like states of thinking that can be
Mhm.
segmented out and chained together in different ways, um, you know, we could think of a language model response as being a single one of those.
Mhm.
And what's increasingly happening is people are creating engineering efforts on top of that model architecture to create the more complex thinking processes that we do internally, sometimes subconsciously, sometimes we're taught them. Like, we're
Mhm.
taught in school often, how to do like critical thinking, how to do, deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning, etc.
Mhm.
And other techniques to study, other techniques to like learn and grow, or to do math even. And so we're trying to kind of distill this into um, technical architecture. Like chain of thought was really interesting. It was a process that was uh, pretty early on in the efforts of language models, like probably like 3 years ago, or no, not even that long. Let's say like a year and a half ago. Time flies.
Mhm.
Where they were just saying to a model, for example, think about this answer step by step,
Mhm.
which is not bad. And then they're like, well, how about this? What if I say, have an output, look at that
Mhm.
output, and say, is that a good output? What's missing from this
Mhm.
output? Um, it's not quite what it needs to be. So let me do another output. So
Mhm.
that was the original like chain of thought thinking, based off of
And
like
Mhm. One
things.
one benefit of chain of thought that's really interesting when you think about like ChatGPT or other things like that is you can basically come up with a plan of like something that you're going to execute, and then when you start losing memory, when you start getting to that token limit of being able to for it to remember the whole conversation that you had, you still kind of have this plan that you can go through, and it can kind of keep outputting stuff even though it's maybe forgetting things, which has
Yeah,
been really, really helpful for people who are programming or people who are doing like, step by step things where you don't necessarily need to know everything about the previous step to do the next step.
yeah, and there's other really interesting things. So, for example, like
Mhm.
you kind of get an insight into how these models solve problems to some degree. I mean, they're often number one better when they do this. They're like
Mhm.
better at solving problems. But
Mhm.
number two, you can also see how they reason through things because you see
Mhm.
their thoughts. They vocalize their thoughts,
Yeah.
and then you can see a
Mhm.
tree of their thoughts. Specifically, this one is all about creating a different kind of architecture. That's more about creating like not just this hierarchical like top down approach. And you had this system over here that they show in this image on my screen called self consistency with chain of thought, which is probably the
Mhm.
current best mechanism for solving problems, where they have like many different opportunities. So they say, well, how do I solve a problem? Well, I can try A, B, or C. Let's walk down the path of A and chain of thought through that one. Cool, this is the answer.
Mhm.
Let's walk down the path of B and chain of thought through that one. Cool, that's the
Mhm.
answer. And then you see go to the very end where you have this final output. This
Mhm.
tree of thought is an evolution of that one, where you kind of say,
Mhm.
let's think of like three answers and validate them and see which one is the best one to some degree.
Mhm.
We'll keep the top two, let's say. In this case, they show the top two that they kept of those three. And they say, wait, okay, now the top one, let's try like four different steps after this one. So if step one is let's solve this problem of like the question is what's the best baseball team? whatever. It can be anything.
Mhm.
And it's like,
Mhm.
cool. To solve this problem, I'm going to think about what are the metrics that are relevant for the best, maybe the ones who won the most World Series, maybe
Mhm.
ones who have had the most home runs or whatever it may be. And it
Mhm.
can kind of go through those steps, and then it'll evaluate. All right, is that a good metric? Let's use that information. Who is the best? Does that make sense? Doesn't really make sense.
Mhm.
So it'll
Mhm.
it'll it'll do that process iteratively over and over again. And with a tree system, each step that it thinks is valid or valuable, it'll not just do one additional step after that one. It'll do another sort of like branching permutation. So not just
Mhm.
think of the next step, think of like 5 different potential steps. Of those 5 steps, which one seems to be the best one? Okay, well, number
Mhm.
3 seems to be the best one. Let me go in that one. Of that one, let's do 5 more of those steps. So you can create this like
Mhm.
branching tree of thoughts that eventually gets
Mhm.
you down to a very valuable answer, which to some degree has some sort of mirroring to the human mind, or some of our processes that we internally have. If not us personally, I know people who think this way, but I know people who think other ways too. So we're
Right.
almost creating a personality in some ways with these models.
Mhm.
I keep going through these anthropomorphized processes to describe this, but like the way
Mhm.
you think is a part of your personality, and the way we tell
Mhm.
these models to think is a part of their quote
Mhm.
unquote personality in my mind.
Mhm. It's like a sorry, computer science nerd over here, but it's sort of like a weighted breadth first search in some regards, right? Because you're
Yes,
kind of like exploring sort of every space, scoring those spaces, and then trying to like find the best path down and remembering sort of like where you came from too, right? That's how it hops
yes.
back to a previous path sometimes, right? It kind of like goes down a path, realizes it's a dead end, and then comes back up and goes back down. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and
Mhm.
and there's lots of math here. There's lots of
Mhm.
information here, and you can absolutely
Mhm.
skip the math if you're not really a math person. And they have like
Mhm.
more human readable stuff here.
Mhm.
Or if you're really interested, there's tons of maybe I'll find one next time. I'll absolutely next podcast. There's tons of tools now where you can feed it a research paper and you can ask it questions and say, hey, can you summarize
Mhm.
what the paper means to me? And it'll summarize it for you. And you can say, well, okay, what are your thoughts about this paper?
Mhm.
What's your feeling? What's your thinking about this?
Mhm.
And yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Really cool. I think it's great. And
Mhm.
I that's my paper of the day I want to share.
Awesome. Yeah,
Um,
awesome. I'm really excited to dive into that one. I haven't seen that one yet. So,
it's great.
uh, and and
This
I'm
reminds
really
me.
obsessed with ways to do all this stuff right now. So, very excited.
Yeah,
What does it remind you of?
Ben does this all the time. Like, Ben is always like he's so interesting seeing him engineer new mechanisms and processes for like these bigger systems to handle models. He's just fantastic. Anyway, it reminds me of some other news I'm going to talk about real quick. Real quick, I'll add it into the end. Some more companies are releasing models that are unique for other reasons. We talk about smaller models.
Mhm.
These models have much bigger context windows. I saw one that
Mhm.
had 65,000 tokens as a window,
Mhm.
and another
Mhm.
one, specifically Claude. Claude is one that we all know
Mhm.
about.
Yeah, Anthropic. Yeah, yeah.
Anthropic.
Claude.
Yeah. Anthropic's the company I mentioned before, who's their ex OpenAI people.
Mhm.
Um, and they made their own company, and Claude is their model, and they have their newer version that can hit 100,000 tokens,
Mhm.
which is quite a bit. To give you an idea of what that means, the current models that we have access to have recently jumped. They've doubled from like 4,000 to 8,000 tokens, and
Mhm.
that's amazing. 8,000 tokens is about 5 pages of text.
Mhm.
You can think of it as about 6,500 words, roughly, because it's four letters a token. The average word is like 5.3 letters, something like that.
Mhm.
So, bingo bango, you have your counting from there. The average page is just like, I don't know how many words. It's like 500 words or something like that. I forget the math of
Mhm.
it, but I
Yeah.
remember roughly that you can get for um, 8,000 tokens. I think it's 5 pages.
Mhm.
And now they're up to 100,000 or so,
Mhm.
which is
Mhm.
10 times that, which is 50 pages.
Mhm.
And that's quite a significant amount of pages. The
Mhm.
difference between 5 pages of text that it can keep in its context versus 50 pages of text
Mhm.
is huge. It's like this paper that I was sharing earlier is about 10 pages long. A model right now couldn't read all that at once. It would have to
Mhm.
chunk it in smaller pieces and go through it,
Mhm.
which is not bad. It's possible, but it's additional engineering effort. But what if you just
Mhm.
screw all that and say, you know what,
Mhm.
read the whole thing at once and give me answers? It
Mhm.
simplifies the engineering, number one. it provides probably
Mhm.
better contextual understanding, number two.
Mhm.
And it's just more powerful and with an output, number three.
Mhm.
Eventually,
Mhm.
if your context window isn't just what it can read, it's also how much it can output.
Mhm.
So if you give it 5 pages of, or let's say you have a max of 50 pages and you give it 25 pages, it can read those 25 pages and then give you
Mhm.
another 25 on top of that.
Mhm.
Uh, for
I'm really
totally,
interested. Yeah, I'm really interested to see, like, is that gonna change how focused it can be in answering a question? Right? Because I think that's the big challenge here is like, you of course have a lot of content and, um, like, this is the best thing about I think about like all the research papers and all the research being done is people kind of ask these questions and then they go and try it out and you can kind of benefit from that research and understanding. Like for
mhm.
instance, there was a paper that I saw recently where asking question with the full word question colon and then the question is better than Q colon question, and it just always produces a better answer. Like, and it's statistically proven, right? And so you've got things like that, and it makes me wonder. Of course, I think this will be better for holistic questioning, right? I've
Mhm.
got this entire document and I want to ask a big question on it. I think it'll be great for that. But when it
Summarize this whole
comes
document.
to, yeah, summarize the whole document. But when it comes to like, hey, tell me who this character is, you know, this character dies in this way in this story, and you're like, oh, like I didn't want that. Like, like you may get details surfacing up that like maybe don't represent like it's just the last detail about that character, right? Because these LLMs are really recency biased in terms
Yeah.
of like how they output things. So if you're telling like a very long story and then you ask it about that story, it may just remember like the last couple chapters of the book, and it may have forgotten some of the details about earlier in the book, and I wonder what that's going to do and like what research we're going to see related to that.
I would be surprised if you needed to have different sorts of reinforcement learning from human feedback um,
Hmm.
for these bigger contexts, where you say, I want you to behave differently when you're reading a document that's like 50 pages, and when you read document that's five
Hmm.
pages.
Hmm.
And that's its own thing. Very fascinating stuff.
Hmm.
But I think we're going to see in the next little while, and this is the next few months. I mean, not like the next like few years. We're going to
Hmm.
see increasingly large context windows, and that's be
Hmm.
very fascinating for a variety of reasons. I think
Hmm.
there are some papers out there who are looking at finding ways to either eschew a window altogether and say it can be unlimited or like millions of tokens, or find ways to be practical and valuably able to use 100 to 200,000 tokens to do more robust things. I think that, for
Hmm.
example, the simplest example I think of is right now you can't get a good book written out of a model from a prompt.
Hmm.
It loses context. Like it can get chapter two in, and it's
Hmm.
not even the best, but it can do it. But then after like that, it's like I can't keep in my mind what was happening in chapter one when I'm on chapter four. So
Right.
I'm gonna just keep going on from chapters three to four, and for number five,
Hmm.
really maybe different than what you see in number one, and you'll slowly over time have a very different book at the end than the beginning.
Hmm.
But what I'm to
Which,
have is holistic output.
yeah, which I think is another thing that's interesting about like the productization of these LLMs right now is like if you were writing an application to do storytelling, you would potentially be building your own memory system because these LLMs really don't have that.
Mhm.
So, like what we saw with the Sims example from a couple weeks ago, where actually that was like last episode, I think, but we basically had this model of this town and all these villagers they had memory, and that memory had to be modeled in a specific way where it kept track of all these different details. And I would imagine for a story, if you wanted to remember all the details that were important, you would sort of like have a room, a scene opens, the room opens, these characters enter, and it would basically be like, hey, remember what this room had in it? Remember what these characters interact with in that room? Remember what these characters know about each other? And all these details. And like maybe even like as an author, you might want like, hey, these characters have these like secret details of information
Yeah,
that other characters don't know about. And so you almost need this like meta memory system to track all that stuff, um
absolutely.
and, and and this is where I think this year is all about architecture. This year is
Yeah.
all about like we've hit the capabilities, we've got these things, there's a bunch of new tools coming in, all the providers of all this stuff are doing a lot of work to give us this great research and these great tooling, but what are we going to do with it? And I think that's what's going to change a lot this year. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. A great point
Yep.
to end it on.
Mhm.
Now
Fantastic.
let's jump right into our section 2, where we have a more open-ended discussion about ethics and AI.
Indeed.
First part, I want you to share your thoughts first too, because I know you care a lot about this stuff. You just showed me your
Mhm.
amazing book, the Midjourney Art Book.
Oh
So the
yeah.
first part, we're talking about the ethical implications of AI in art. Now, I got I'm going to read them out loud for
Mhm.
you right now. The suggestions from GT4 as to what topics we can talk about. Questions for discussion. First one, how might AI generated art affect our understanding and appreciation of human creativity? Question two,
Mhm.
how should copyright laws adapt to AI generated arts?
Mhm.
Now, there are tons of other things we talked about, but I want to kind of throw that into the ether. And
Mhm.
before I get you to answer questions, I want you to give me your base raw feelings about AI art, and with the only subset of that being specifically the ethical considerations of AI art.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of cool pieces to it, of course, and I am definitely somebody who's drawn to the cool pieces. When I think of the ethical pieces too, though, there's like there's a future piece here. I think the future piece is really like I'm an artist. I'm spending my time on this. I'm putting a lot of my soul into this, and like, where's my outcome, right? A lot of like the way that our society has evolved, I think looking kind of at like medieval Europe and thinking about like capitalism and the ability to have like sort of free enterprise and not be reliant so much on like kingdoms and like kings to be able to like commission pieces of art, right? People have been able to like actually create businesses that enable them to be able to do this stuff, right? And it's not common good. It's like individual good, that there's a belief that your individuality can be expressed and rewarded, right? That kind of entire space there, that's what art is right now, right?
Mhm.
And when you comes to how these, you know, art tooling is changing using AI and how potentially easy it is to produce some art, how challenging it is to now produce other art, um, I think that's where we're seeing like a kind of a lot of questions, mainly based on like what's the future here, right? There was this ability for us to have a future, right? There was this appreciation, this idea of being able to have things commissioned, be able to, you know, have a very large set of support for a large group of people who really want to be passionate about art as output. Um, and I think there's kind of two factors there. One is like, is this going to increase how much we want art, right? How much we need it? Is there, because I think with software and with AI, um, AI is going to enable us to create a lot more software. I think every company in the world wants more software. So I don't think it's going to drop. Like I don't
Yeah,
think that there's going to be like a decreased demand, right?
the cricket shrink is that we don't have enough people who can make software for us.
Mhm.
That's
Right.
generally it.
That
There's always more and more requirements, more and more need, more and more
mhm.
want for software. And the constraint
Yeah.
is like we don't have the money to afford to make all the software we want to make.
Mhm. But is that
Same for
thing
art.
true for art? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think I think that there is to some degree. I think there's niches of art, like Midjourney, for example, right? I pay for a subscription for Midjourney. That's fairly net new. I wasn't paying an art subscription before, right? If you
Mhm.
can call that art, right? I wasn't paying for that previously, but I see a lot of benefit in like I do hobbyist activities or we do this podcast and stuff, and it's something that like I, as a very rudimentary programmer artist, but I have half of an art degree. You know, I could put something together for this stuff. I've done that for some websites and stuff like that, and I can do diagrams and I can do certain stuff. But I like what Midjourney gives me. It gives us this capability to be able to express ourselves in this way,
Mhm.
and it does expand the market a bit, right? It does expand that sort of total addressable market into places that maybe wouldn't have paid for that prior, right?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Like, there's more and more games, like indie games, that are using
Mhm,
generated art as their
mhm,
assets. Whereas
mhm,
before, maybe somebody was a developer. It's like I can code, but I have
mhm,
no art chops, and I don't have the
mhm,
money to afford to pay someone to do arts. Then the
mhm,
answer was like, well, you're kind of out of luck, or use like open source assets already that exist.
right.
If you want anything customized, though, you couldn't do
Mhm.
it. But
Mhm.
now in the middle, you can say, well, I can pay $20 a month, or
Mhm.
pay for nothing and get like an open source one, and
Mhm.
just generate my images, my assets, my backgrounds, my character design, etc.,
Mhm.
all after like a few seconds of interactions. You can
Mhm.
now create games that are much more artistically expressive, let's say,
Mhm.
for the same cost as it would have taken you to make like a text-based game to some degree.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
is that a net benefit? Probably to some degree. I think a lot of
Mhm.
people, I think people who play games, people who consume games, they'll be
Mhm.
like, "Oh, this is pretty." That makes me happy
Mhm.
to see a pretty thing in front of me. Let's play a game.
Right.
Um,
And I
but
think if you look at games too, the most underpaid space of a game is the story.
mm,
That's the place where, like, it's kind of an afterthought. It's like, let's get the effects, let's get the gameplay, let's get the art in, and then there's no money left, really. We've already spent, $40 million on this thing. Let's, like, push it. Like, we gotta go, you know? So it does make me wonder, like, hey, maybe now there could be more opportunity in that space to some degree.
yeah, and I mean, like, there's a lot of cool things you can do. You can make dynamic
Mhm.
things. What about a game
Mhm.
on the fly that will take the card game, and the art for the card is dynamic.
Mhm.
Like something happens and you find a new card,
Mhm.
digitally unwrap it, and in the
Mhm.
background, it's like I'm gonna just generate it for you. I'm gonna give you some
Mhm.
generated text. I'm gonna give you some
Mhm.
generated images. I'm gonna make the strain so that it actually doesn't like suck too much or isn't too great of a card,
Mhm.
but fits in the
Mhm.
world. And there you go.
Mhm.
It's yours. Nobody else has this card in the entire world. No other game
Mhm.
has this card. This card is only made on your machine. That's a
Mhm.
powerful thing that we could have never done before. Not really.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
now we can potentially do that kind of stuff. That's a net new opportunity provided to us by these technologies and techniques. And
Mhm.
we can talk, I can talk your ear off, you can talk my ear off about all the good things that can happen from this.
Mhm.
But I want
Mhm.
you to answer a question. I'm going to be hypothetically devil's advocate here.
Mhm.
Um, One thing I hear a lot, and I've talked to people a lot about this, people who are very artistically inclined. Um, what about the human element that we lose by putting
Mhm.
AI model in front of everybody and giving
Mhm.
them their own generated art that they maybe can customize, but to some degree
Mhm.
lose the influences of those around them from. Like, now it's no longer about,
Mhm.
you know, I don't know, Monet.
Mhm.
I can say I want art to look like this, and I can ignore
Mhm.
any external influences in my art. I can have it being entirely self-interest driven,
Mhm.
and we lose something from that. And even
Mhm.
deeper, does the human experience lose something from not toiling over art?
Mhm.
I think it's something I've heard a lot about is people say
Mhm.
that if you don't suffer for your art, it's
Mhm.
not art. A lot
Mhm.
of that is about what isn't art. And I don't,
Mhm.
I'm not saying I believe or buy any of these arguments
Mhm.
necessarily, but I want to actually do my due diligence and walk through
Mhm.
them and navigate through them and hear your thoughts about them.
Yeah, there's 2 places that I think of. One is, so when I went to design school, I loved animation. I think animation was, like, my favorite course. I think I was probably the best at it because I like thinking about human anatomy. I like thinking about movement of the body and, like, how a fall works and how, like, a step has, like, this certain gait and, like, the gait, like, kinda goes up and down. Um, and, like, there's a lot of aspects of that and kind of details of that I enjoyed doing. Um, Details of that when it's hand done, it feels special,
Mhm.
right? It feels special to you. There's a sort of aspect of it that, like, um, when you do those specific little touches, and I'm sure if you kind of look at, like, Disney, or when you look at Pixar, there's a lot of, like, these, like, very small touches of what happens in those animations and the detail work there. That's where a lot of the magic is. It's also not the best place for these models to some degree. Like, they do a really good job of, like, the brute forcing piece of it, but when it comes to the detailing, I can't really get what I want out of Midjourney. I have a lot of happy accidents. I think most people do. I think most people sort of, like, type in something and it's like, "Oh, like, this isn't really what I thought." It's not. It's like when you watch a movie after reading a book and you see the characters and you're like, "Oh, like, those are, oh, I mean, yeah, sure. I guess that could be what, like, Harry Potter looks like, but, like, I had definitely pictured this different kid, you know. Uh and I think it's, to some degree, your experience as an artist being able to, like, put your vision out there is limited by these tools to some degree, especially the kind of like capture all tooling. One thing we saw with that research paper talking about like the LLMs and the simulation, simulated town, was when the villagers talked to each other, they all communicated in like an upbeat and helpful way. Similarly, I think when
Mm,
we're looking at these models that produce art, it's going to fall into this very general trough, right? Of like, this is like how, either depending on like how the model is sort of trained, it's like, this is what humans reinforce the most. So like, this is like the thing most people like. Therefore, this is like a trendy, like sort of art piece. Or it's based on an established artist that has been trained by the model.
mm.
And so it's sort of that person's style. But if you're looking for your own style, there's not an easy way to sort of find it. Um, you can kind of almost happen upon styles though, which is interesting.
With our
You
own
definitely,
combinations. Yeah.
yeah. I remember you showed me the one where it's like all these painting, like splotches,
Yes.
and somebody had created these awesome like car splotches, and like it's like super
Yeah.
colorful, super like gritty. It has this awesome feel to it. Um, you can almost find your own style there. So I think there's kind of these different pieces. I think if you're an artist and you pride yourself on your skills, the skills are changing
Mm.
to some degree, and that's really scary.
And
Um,
uncomfortable for people. And I understand that. I really
yeah,
do get that. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. But
Even
I
in our
also think
industry.
like, yeah, even especially in our industry, yeah, it would be scary to be in a lot of different places in our field. Um, and I think, but I also think like if George Lucas had this capability when he was thinking about building Star Wars, I think it would have been an insane, massive, sprawling
Mm,
universe, right? With so much detail and like so many more alien races and so many more, like the capability for creation is huge.
mhm,
Um, the so like there's sort of there's two pieces there. One is sort of like you're losing this personal identity and this idea that like you were going to go to work every day and you were going to hop into your computer and you were going to hop into Unreal and you were going to do the specific task. And the challenge against that mental vision of your future,
mm.
that's really scary. And then also the ability to do all these crazy things. There's these two poles that are like
Yeah, and
diametrically opposed.
I
Yeah.
imagine somebody, let's say, who just hit their 10,000 hours in
Hmm.
like digital art creation. They've been doing it
Hmm.
for years, and now they're like, I
Hmm.
am actually an expert. People pay good money for this. I
Hmm.
know how to navigate all these tools perfectly. And then this comes out. I can
Hmm.
empathize with how frustrating that would be in your position.
Hmm.
You're now somebody who feels like you wasted your time,
Hmm.
or you feel like challenged because it's like I spend hours on making this art beautifully, and people like that person's art more, and they put in some
Hmm.
silly prompt, and it made this thing that just looks traditionally good in a way that people would like because that's how they're trained to output images.
Hmm.
I think that this is of course understandable.
Hmm.
And there's, I don't think we think less of people being upset at that. I think that's
Hmm.
who wouldn't be upset in that situation.
Hmm.
But I also feel like it's one of those things you have to grieve and move on from over
Hmm.
time,
Hmm.
because there's no going back. There's no putting the genie back in the
Hmm.
bottle.
Hmm.
If this is a flash in the pan and we can move on, and a lot of people are hoping that's the case,
Hmm.
then be angry and then hopefully
Hmm.
hold out and it'll get better. But I
Hmm.
don't suspect that's the case here. I think that
Hmm.
these tools will only get better. We saw one already that
Hmm.
improves it today. They will
Hmm.
increasingly get more robust. They'll get quicker.
Hmm.
They'll give you more
Hmm.
variation, and we'll learn to use them, and we'll learn to find
Hmm.
our role with them over time.
Hmm.
And
And
I think being a part of that is important.
and I think the thing that's especially dangerous right now is this 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 challenge and that belief in the future. Because I think there are a lot of people that when they see digital art that was created with the assistance of AI, there's a strong sort of revulsion in some groups to
Mm,
be like, okay, we have to fight this. We have to push this down. We have to like be opposed to this. Um, and at the same time, some of those people are the same people that are trying to get into that space so that they can compete, right?
Mm.
And so this sort of battle going on there, and I think uh, I think there's a real challenge in being able to sort of just like empower artists to be able to create however they want to create, but to understand that like yeah, this is a problem, but it's not about the person, right? It's not about any of the
Yeah.
people that are like using this, right? It just happens to be like this is the challenge, right?
This is the
And if
new
you're
world
kind
that
of
we all are going into.
yeah, it's and everyone's trying to figure out like what's a way forward, right? And we have to find a future. We have to find a future for art. We have to find a future for artists. So we just have to figure out what it is, right? And you know whether that's you know uh, state sponsored art or whether that is a radical way of being able to like understand copyright, or whether that is extreme regulation like we're starting to see in Europe. uh there could be some different things here.
Okay, so let's go to the next topic. The next topic is jobs. Of course, this is one I think a lot of people feel strongly about. Geoffrey Hinton, this is one of those things he feels strongly about as well too.
Mhm.
I think let me kick this off real quick. I think the questions that our fun GPT-4 tool says we should talk about are which sectors are the most at risk and how can we prepare for this transition, and how might
Mhm.
governments and businesses ensure a just transition for workers.
Mhm.
So it's already assuming there's going to be a transition, number one, which is maybe fair, and I think this is true. I think that jobs are changing. I've been reading a lot of reports from companies who are talking about how over the next 5 to 10 years, they're like, well, we probably think we're going to replace a lot of our jobs with AI, and
Mhm.
that's going to change these jobs and these jobs and these jobs. And understandably, a lot of people who are especially in those jobs currently are feeling anxious, and yeah, why wouldn't you be feeling that way?
Mhm.
One thing I read sometimes is I go onto Reddit and I read this subreddit called freelance writers or freelance writing, one of the two.
Mhm.
And it's a bustling subreddit, especially right now, as they are contending with GPTs of the world, 3.5s and 4s, sports especially.
Mhm.
A lot of them are losing jobs and opportunities, and a lot of them are competing against these models. A lot of them are even annoyed because while they write these things out that are like perfectly their own original works, the tools that we have to analyze and see if something is actually written by a language model or a human are
Mhm.
not perfect. They're actually wrong quite often. So
Mhm.
they'll give that to a client puts it to a machine, and they're like, this wasn't written by you, it's written by a machine. I'll
Mhm.
keep it, but I'm not gonna be at full price because you didn't write it. But like I
Mhm.
did it. I did write it, I swear. And that's a
Yep.
whole level of like complexity there too.
Mhm.
Um, but I think to summarize, I think the overall frustration they feel is
Mhm.
that it feels like this entire industry is on its last legs to them.
Mhm.
Because a lot of what they do is they write things like SEO copy for a website, or they'll write, HR descriptions
Mhm.
of job postings, or they'll write, PR descriptions of events
Mhm.
and news articles sometimes,
Mhm.
summarizations of things that have happened in stocks, things like that. And increasingly, these like constant, financial, let's say, inputs that they had are being slowly cut off.
Mhm.
And I can appreciate that be very upsetting, and a lot of them are very upset.
Mhm.
And you can hear them talk about it, and a lot of them are very also resigned to the fact that this is not going to get better. It's going to
Mhm.
go worse for them.
Mhm.
And that is fair. And I think that's one of many jobs that might be challenged.
Mhm.
If someone's job is to make slides, um, then you might be challenged when the tools for making slides with the prompt come out. If
Mhm.
their jobs is to handle sheets, like Google Sheets or Excel sheets,
Mhm.
um, maybe not entirely because you still need a human, a lot of those elements, but a lot of the things that you are technically very good at, like using the very complicated tools and complicated like functions and
Mhm.
techniques out of those frameworks, can
Mhm.
be distilled now into a prompt by somebody. Says, hey, can you take
Mhm.
my Excel data or take my like CSV data or my emails or whatever data from wherever and turn it into a financial report for this month's quarter with highlighting and like, tables and filters and all that stuff built in. Cool.
Mhm.
Done in 5 seconds. No problem.
Mhm.
I think that there's going to be challenges with this, and I think there'll be increasingly more challenges.
Mhm.
And I think the question I have more than anything else is, what do we think is the best case scenario? Hypothetically, Ben, I want you to try to empathize with somebody who's upset about this world where models are taking more of the skilled labor that we rely on.
Mhm.
And I asked them, what would you want to happen? What do you think they would want to have happen? What do you think their instinctual response will be?
For the skilled labor specifically,
Yeah,
mhm.
like
Like
what
what
I how would you solve the problem? I asked them, how are you going to
mhm.
solve the problem? What do you think needs to happen to protect people or to give you the best
Mhm.
possible outcome in this world that we're moving towards?
Mhm. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think the base instinct, I think of a lot of different people is oftentimes it's like the coal workers, right? It's like, hey, like let's try and keep this thing going,
Mm,
right? It's like let's figure out like the way to like entrench ourselves and like build political allies and like let's keep this going. Let's add subsidies from the government and like drive on this thing. And I think that's sort of like the fear-driven mentality end of this. It's normal. I think everyone feels like that a bit, all like often. I think at the other end, though, it's interesting because like if you take the example of like the freelancers that are having their jobs like sort of replaced, um, there's other places where we need deeper understanding of what content is on a page and like
mm.
what we're trying to deliver to the page.
This is
Uh,
something to cut you off
yeah.
real quick.
Mhm.
Some of the advice that they give, like the moderators of that sub, they say
Mhm.
your that job that you have is no longer
Mhm.
be relevant.
Mhm.
Specialize. Find something that's very, very, very specific and powerful, where
Mhm.
the language model cannot do as well as the human can.
Mhm.
Getting
Mhm.
niche, specific information, technical
Mhm.
information, specialized information about a field.
Mhm.
If you want to succeed as a freelance writer now, you have to move in that direction. So yeah,
Mhm.
to your point, I think this is the advice that people are given right now.
Yeah, and I think because the thing that you have as somebody who is in a profession is you have expertise, right? Whether you're like a truck driver and you want to start training models on like how to better drive trucks and how to get across like different systems, you can help like sort of moderate like how trucks drive, right? Tesla hires truck drivers to be able to better understand how trucks should respond to different situations and like oversee trucks that are on the road and like make sure they're not doing anything bad, right? So there's sort of like outlets like that. If you were like a freelance writer, there's of course a lot of content like CMS systems or even like efforts to improve systems. Like so, if you take the idea of like A/B testing, right? We've got a website, it works, but I want to be able to like sell more product or I want to be able to do something more with it, make sure it resonates better with people. There is like a very great space there to think about, okay, how do we improve content, right? And then like can you start thinking about, okay, what are ways that people better understand how these sites should work? Are there better ways to communicate that stuff, right? There are sort of like ways to specialize in that. Um but it is sort of like somebody referenced I'm trying to remember who it was, but there's this idea of like a talent stack. There's this idea of like it's not about any one skill that you have, but it's about how all the skills and strengths that you have stack up, make you somewhat more unique in terms of like being able to um, offer value generally, right? So there, I think the thing that may be interesting, and rather than thinking about sort of like retraining, it's sort of like uh, it's enhancing the skills that you've got, right? It's not about taking those people that had this one job and transitioning it completely to a different job. It's about sort of like how do we take that and then we transition it to something that's sort of close, right? Um, And that's easier or harder depending on what it is. If you're a knowledge worker, if you're like a writer, it's easier. It just is. Like you're already somebody who's at a computer probably at this point, right?
Mhm.
So there's a lot of jobs that are like at a computer. If you are somebody who isn't at a computer though, that's different, right? But I don't know. There's a lot of space to change there. Some for the better. I think like if you look at like food service right now, food service, at least in America, is thought of as like a dead end job, right? In general, like people aren't excited to go into it, right? You have to deal with customers. Customers can be kind of
Mhm.
challenging to deal with. There needs to be you know, a revival of that generally because everyone loves going to restaurants though. you know, there isn't
Y-
there isn't that a balance on the other side of the equation. It's just generally it's a bad experience to work for these companies that are running a restaurant, right? So how do we rethink that job? How do we rethink how that should be done, right?
How do we
Rethink
make
tipping.
jobs that are things that machines and AI cannot handle, make them
Mhm,
more valuable, make them more fulfilling as well to fill that
mhm,
gap that may be brewing. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. But let me ask you a question.
mhm,
So I don't know if you heard Sam Altman. He gets asked this question a lot,
mhm,
and he has his own strong opinions on the future of work and humanity.
mhm,
And he did not talk about anything that's soon, like not like the next year or two or
mhm,
five even necessarily. But
mhm,
he doesn't think this is super far off, and this is also true for Geoffrey Hinton, that we might see a significant portion of jobs be displaced quickly, and that
mhm,
may be painful for society. And he has his own thoughts. Sam Altman thinks about like WorldCoin, something he invests in,
mhm,
for like distributed universal basic income.
mhm,
And I know that Geoffrey Hinton is just more thinking like we need to talk about it. He doesn't have a solution in mind. He's like we should
mhm,
talk about the job thing because I think the job thing is a real thing that's going to happen.
mhm, mhm,
So let's move past that. The job thing, real quick, basically is this idea that there won't be any jobs or not enough jobs in the future, and we might see mass unemployment. Now, uh, that's an interesting question, and we can have a whole podcast about that idea and do about that. But more specifically, one thing I've been kind of thinking about myself in my head is: do you think there is inherent value, something integrally important about somebody working every day? Do you think
mhm,
something would be lost if, let's say somebody finds a solution to the problem that's
mhm,
like pie in the sky idyllic. They can
mhm,
give people money. They find it, they
mhm,
figure out how to do it, and everyone has their own income. They don't have to worry about
mhm,
jobs. They can do whatever they want all day. They can relax.
mhm,
Some people worry that there's something inherently wrong about this. This is even true to
mhm,
like an older religious idea, like
mhm.
um, an idle hand, like is what's the term? It's like the
Oh,
devil's glove bit on an idle hand or something, things like that.
right.
Or somebody who's not working, somebody who's not doing anything will sin.
Mhm, right.
Uh, do you, maybe not nothing that dramatic, but do you think
Yeah.
there's any truth in that idea?
Yeah. I mean, I remember when Sam Altman was talking with like Lex Friedman on his podcast, and they kind of
Mhm,
talked about this a little bit and how people are sort of confused on whether or not they want jobs. Like France is like rioting because like the retirement age is going up, and
mhm.
then at the same time, people are like, "Oh my god, like we're not going to have any jobs," you know. So it's sort of like, wait, what do we want? I think the challenge is really it has a lot more to do with the evolution of community. I read *Sapiens*. That's a book that I really enjoyed reading. I think it's a great book for thinking about different perspectives, whether or not you believe in what it proposes.
Mm.
Um, One thing that has happened is, in terms of community, what our society in kind of North America has become is that um, we have basically said that the government provides, that the state provides a lot of things. So it's like if you get sick and old, you can go to a hospital, you can go to like an old folks home. There's some, if you get sick, there's a doctor here. If you need to be educated, there we have schools. There's all these sort of things that are external and like the state provides, right? And that has kind of gone against the previous things, which were very community based, right? And it was like, oh, you kind of had to stay with your family, otherwise you're dead. you know, like you go out there and there's no community for you, like you're not going to get help.
How are you gonna
There's
get food?
nobody.
Yeah, like
Yeah,
your dad hunted, your mom
yeah,
gathered.
hmm
Um, and they have a farm out back. You
Yeah.
want to go out there get your own food? There's no supermarkets. There's no game that'll fall into your hands.
Right.
You had to like find the money too to even be able to
Mhm,
afford anything, and it'd be much more
mhm,
sparse. And food
mhm,
itself was a bigger proportion of people's income. Like I think it used to be like
mhm,
50 to 75% of your income was tied towards food when
mhm.
like even like 200-300 years ago.
Right. Yeah. And so I think, we transition to this culture of that the state provides. And the state also provides purpose, right? Your purpose of your life is working in sort of the North American culture, right? Your purpose is that. I mean, church also provides a purpose, but it's not state. Like the division of church and state is different, right? Um, Certain folks, of course, find that the church offers potentially better education or better health care options or better, like community feeling. And so there's sort of this push toward like a theocratic type government.
Mhm.
Um, but when you think about like whether or not we need jobs, it's like really it's like whether or not we need community to some degree. And I think in every major city, like I live in a massive condo building. Um, I don't know most of the people on my floor. I know one guy just because he goes to the gym that I go to. So I'm like, oh yeah, I know that guy. Every once in a while we have the awkward elevator ride together. But like we don't know most of the people who are in our buildings, and there's no common spaces. There's no easy space for everyone to sort of mingle or learn about each other. It's not like the kind of yard that you may have used to have, like in more rural areas,
Yeah.
or you know when you went to the mailbox, there were five other mailboxes there, and you kind of run into somebody, and
Mhm.
and they'd be your neighbor, and it's different, right?
We you're right. I
Um,
think we've increasingly made our world one in which we can interact with people less and less. Like even
mhm,
going shopping now, we go on Amazon. Um,
yeah,
yeah, we order so much of our needs, and
mhm,
we work remotely increasingly so.
mhm,
Um, the community that we'd have to have, even just by nature of the world we lived in, is
mhm,
now increasingly small.
mhm,
So suddenly we get cut off from work, and even if everything went perfectly, um, would we be isolated, living alone
mhm,
in our homes, ordering in
mhm,
food, typing on
mhm,
our computers? I'm sure plenty of people would be doing that actually.
mhm. Absolutely. And now, I think the other thing that's interesting is like the job market's crazy, right? So you've got all these people that are now applying for jobs, and you have to compete with your sort of digital representation of yourself over any other aspect, right? Which is terrible. I gotta say, as somebody who's like a very personable person or like charismatic person, I really enjoy talking to somebody face to face,
Mm,
and I kind of can't imagine like even accepting a job without maybe meeting them or
mm.
like knowing who I'm working with or like being able to see the office. And like so many people have maybe had 3 jobs at this point, never seeing an office, never meeting these people face to face, right? And I'm like, "Whoa, that's crazy." You know?
Some of the
Um,
most romantic memories I have in my entire life are
mhm,
of the company we work at right now. When I was really
mhm,
young, like startup vibes, going on the rooftop, having a drink at Friday night after we worked all week really hard,
mhm,
enjoying the summer air, going out dancing with my coworkers, laughing, running like not for profits, like running like extracurricular activities together, just kind of
mhm.
getting into this really strong community vibe. I forget all the work I did. I remember that stuff though.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's something that if we get into something like universal basic income or we get into something else and robots do take half of our jobs, which is great, but then it's sort of like, well, we just need something else, right?
Yeah, like hypothetically speaking, let's say we
Mhm,
hit our utopian society. I mean, like I think that the thing people talk about a lot is like the dystopian stuff and the
mhm,
challenges there, and I think that's fair and legitimate.
mhm,
But I think
mhm,
there's challenges even with the utopian world that we can envision. Even the
mhm,
best case scenario, we never have to work again. All the jobs are taken from us. We can just relax and rest on the laurels. What are
mhm.
you going to do with that time?
Right.
How are you gonna enrich your life? Are you gonna enjoy your
Mhm,
life? Are
mhm,
you gonna take up a hobby? Are you going to find ways to connect with the community more?
mhm,
Um, are you gonna stay at home play video games all day? I think this is the challenge
mhm,
as well too. I think that increasingly, um, as this technology gets better, I can
mhm,
imagine a world. Sincerely, my own
mhm,
personal challenge. I'll describe to you right now.
Mhm.
I like very particular kinds of games. I have games that I in my mind that I love, and every once in a while,
Mhm.
I won't find any more that exist. I play them all. Good example is
Mhm.
Diablo. I love Diablo.
Mhm.
Diablo 4
Mhm.
comes out in like, oh man, it comes out in like a week. Ah,
Mhm.
yes. Uh, eventually, I'll play my heart out, and I played like hundreds of hours of Diablo.
Mhm.
Skyrim too, lots of hours.
Mhm.
Imagine you've played Skyrim, this game that everyone played, huge game,
Mhm.
um, and it always added new content for you, exactly the kind of
Mhm.
content you liked.
Mhm.
It could see what you liked, and it would just generate for you automatically. Oh, it's a new
Mhm.
quest, sir. This
Mhm.
fair maiden in this tower is being assaulted by a dragon. It's like, all right, I'll go check it out. And it gives you
Mhm.
some rewards and feedback loop, some dopamine hit, like the social
Yeah, yeah.
media situation, but
Yeah.
one in which isn't social inherently, but one that is
Mhm.
entirely personal. This
Mhm.
dopamine hit that just gives you validation, it gives you the
Mhm.
feeling of enjoyment, it gives you a personal experience that you crave and want,
Mhm.
never ending. We already feel it a bit with like, media, with like um, going on to Netflix and all the other now providers we have and saying, what do I
Mhm.
feel like? Literally, I can watch a dozen like Academy winning, award winning shows whenever I want,
Mhm.
pardon me, that I haven't seen. There's so much more content out there that's high quality than I'll ever see,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
increasingly so. As much as we
Mhm.
complain about the bad stuff, there's probably more bad quality content. There's
Sure.
just an increase in overall content. There's
Mhm.
tons of shows that are fantastic. I'm not gonna
Mhm.
watch Succession. I've heard good things about
Mhm.
it. Heard it's amazing.
Mhm.
I'll never watch it. I don't have time for it.
Right.
Like nothing shows like
Yeah.
that. I will not watch.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
The
I
Wire, I'll not watch. And
Yeah.
I think we're gonna be inundated with these experiences that are increasingly
Mhm.
gonna drag our attention. And I
Mhm.
think it's gonna challenge even this world you're describing, where we find a
Mhm.
way to socially connect with other people. And I think that
Mhm.
will be potentially the weird utopian dystopian future if we're not careful,
Mhm.
where
Mhm.
we create our own internal fantasies, our own internal worlds that
Mhm.
we can our own personal bubbles. We already have our social media bubbles
Mhm.
that are like me and my group of like 20 friends or 50 friends or
Mhm.
100 friends who all have the same thing. What if it's
Mhm.
just me and myself and 100 digital beings who
Mhm.
validate me, tell me I'm handsome and great and wonderful,
Mhm.
and you see
Mhm.
these like AI girlfriends coming out,
Yeah.
and a game that is also all that I want, and music that's also all that I want to hear and
Mhm.
like, and I don't have to do anything or talk to anybody ever again to get a
Mhm.
constant dopamine drip feed.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. And it begs, I guess, from that end, it sort of begs the question is like, are we okay with, morally sort of like embracing hedonism to some degree
yeah,
and just being like okay with a society where people maybe don't contribute back, right? Where people just consume and just take and like and enjoy, right? And is that utopia, right? Is utopia the ability for us to be able to do that, or is that, you know, is that negating this kind of like positive future? I remember reading The Fall by Neil Stevenson, which is it's an okay book, but it talks about basically when people die, their brains are sort of uploaded into this like environment where they can sort of interact with other people. It's sort of the afterlife to some degree.
it's like Sanjay
Um,
Hero, the episode of Black Mirror. They have that same
a
idea.
bit,
Yeah.
yeah. Except for nothing's pre-constructed
Hmm.
because all these brains sort of like there's no way of understanding like how a brain understands the world, especially when it's like a disembodied brain. Like there's no physical aspects to the world. And so these brains sort of like reconstructing sort of what they know instinctively to some degree. Um, and there's a group of the brains that sort of get together of these people who have now died and their brains have been uploaded, who get together and they create this hive of sort of like hedonism to some degree, where it kind of lives and breathes by these like deep neural connections between all these different people and beings, and they all kind of feel as a group. And in the sort of book, there's like a main character that's like the future shouldn't be like this, and they destroy it, and force them all to like sort of live like serfs in a medieval world. And but it is sort of that. It's like there
Yeah.
is this draw toward what if there were no worries? What if we could embrace everything? What if we could have this sense of that, everything's always good all the time? Um,
Even the best case
yeah.
scenario is rife with challenges. I think
Mhm.
that there's plenty of challenging scenarios that are very likely to happen in the near future, where people
Mhm.
who are freelance writers or who are
Mhm.
conceptual artists, or
Mhm.
people who are Excel experts and Photoshop experts or
Mhm.
whomever are going to be challenged in some ways.
Mhm.
Developers might be challenged. There's
Mhm.
gonna be a ton of these challenges that are going to be very pertinent to our lives.
Yeah.
And there's going to be proponents who are like, let's fight for a world where no one has to work. And those who say,
Mhm.
absolutely not. Everybody should work all the time or else. And something in the middle as
Yeah.
well. Um,
Yeah.
but then it's like, what? Well, let's think of the best case scenario. What
Mhm.
is what is what does that mean for us?
Mhm.
Let's fight for the best case scenario. Let's
Mhm.
fight for our own individual heavens.
Mhm.
This is the reason why I asked that question. Actually, I've
Mhm.
been asking that question to people more lately.
Mhm.
I've asked you a couple times, Ben. If you
Yeah.
could picture your own personal heaven, what would it look like? Not because I think we're gonna get it, not because I think
Mhm.
there is a heaven. Nothing to do with that. I mean, that's all
Mhm.
whatever. The relevance is that I think we don't ever actually think about the best case scenario.
Mhm.
I think we think about chasing towards a disembodied heaven,
Mhm.
and we don't even know what we do when we get it.
Right.
I ask this question, and almost everybody I ask that question to has absolutely no idea how to answer the question at first.
Yeah.
No,
Absolutely.
they're like,
Mhm.
"What? What do I have to be? I have no idea." And I ask them again, and they usually come back to me. I honestly come back to
Mhm.
me after a couple of weeks or whatever, like
Mhm.
Della, I have an answer. I know what
Mhm.
that is now. I know. Um, so I think
That's interesting.
it's worth us thinking about that. It's worth us thinking
Mhm.
about not even necessarily our heavens, but
Mhm.
thinking about our best case scenarios.
Mhm.
We can fear a lot of things. We have a lot of anxiety about what things can happen, but our
Mhm.
jobs necessarily being impacted. But
Mhm.
what do we think we would want to happen? What do you think we would strive towards? What would we like to
Mhm.
strive towards? And how can we
Mhm.
get there?
Yeah.
Questions that we don't ask ourselves enough, I think.
Mhm. I think the thing that I feel right now most strongly when it comes to that is I think there needs to be a way to be successful taking a breath, taking a break, and kind of recovering, or even just like living a slower pace of life. I think there needs to be a way to be successful doing that. And at the same time, or maybe even in the same world, there also needs to be a way that if you want to hustle, if you want to push yourself as hard as you can be successful that way.
Because
Right. There
still, a
can't,
lot of people,
yeah.
that's light, that's meaning to them, right?
Hmm. Absolutely.
If you tell them go live on a farm that we
Hmm.
make build for you, and you have all your
Hmm.
needs taken care of, they'd be like, "No, I don't want to do that. I want to do
Yeah.
something else. I want to fight. I want to challenge myself. I want to grow.
Hmm.
I want to work." Um,
Hmm. Yeah. And
that has,
self-actualization is one of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
yeah.
So our ability to self-actualize is very important. So whatever world we see, we need to be able to give people that capability. So
I'm gonna read The Fall. I think that you've sold that idea to me a little bit. It seems interesting.
yeah,
I
it's
read a lot of sci-fi, and this is not an
yeah.
uncommon topic in sci-fi. And I think
Yeah.
we're kind of moving towards the sci-fi world. We're talking about AI every day,
Mhm.
so yeah, I feel like
Absolutely.
maybe we need to revisit some sci-fi tropes and understand the questions being asked in them a bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we've definitely hit a lot of stuff here, but it sounds like there's one
Yeah,
more place you want to go.
Geoffrey Hinton.
Yeah.
Um, so for those who don't know, Geoffrey Hinton is often referred to as the godfather of deep learning. He's been in this industry for a long time. He's been in it since the 70s or 80s. He's been in it through the AI winter, and where in the 80s and 90s, where we kind of realized that AI wouldn't give us what we wanted to as quickly as we did. We had a really strong idea in the 80s and 90s, like, cool, we're gonna have robots like the Jetsons.
Mhm.
And we're like, maybe, let's try. And we're like, oh, God,
Mhm.
no, not anytime soon. Not for decades. No, we're not close. And then all the money dried up for a bit. And we're kind of in a summer right now, in a resurgence, maybe even
Mhm.
a spring. And he was a big part of that resurgence actually. In
Mhm.
2012, him and his students created AlexNet, and
Mhm.
that was this like that was a model for a competition to classify images. You give it an image, and you have to get the AI to tell you what's in that image. In 2012, this was very hard, and we're not very good at it. Now this is like old hat. It's boring. They have to have new
Mhm.
competitions now. But that was one using deep learning, which is the
Mhm.
mechanisms and the techniques that we have today, where you have these layers of, uh, of networks that can be better at understanding things. Anyway, they solved that, or they won that competition, and then
Mhm.
Google gave them a lot of money, and they hired out all the staff. Um, you know who was on that team, by the way? Something very interesting.
Ilya, right?
Yeah, Elias Escaver. Elias Escaver, it was in UFT. This is all in UFT,
Mhm,
University of Toronto. And
mhm,
he was on that team, and he is now the chief engineer, not the CTO, just the chief engineer of
mhm,
OpenAI. And
mhm,
you should hear him talk. He's a fascinating person. He has his own interviews with a ton of people, including not Sam Altman, um, what's his name? The guy who interviewed Sam Altman you mentioned earlier.
oh, Lex Friedman.
Lex Friedman, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm,
I think he's his own Lex Friedman interviews,
mhm,
and he's a very smart guy. He's very very considerate of these things. He talked about the future before. Anyway, tangent. Geoffrey Hinton, he has been working for Google for a long time. He's been working out of UFT for a long time in the Vector Institute in UFT that was built by joint effort from Google and UFT
mhm,
to have AI in be a big part of the university. And he quit. He's in his late 70s, and he quit not because he feels like he was being mistreated, but because what he says is like, I feel like Google is very good to me, very nice, and all those wonderful things, but I want to be able to talk about how I feel openly, and the
mhm,
fears I have, without dealing with the fact that I work at Google.
mhm.
And can you summarize in your mind what he's saying?
Yeah, I mean, he's really saying like when you're a part of an organization, like we're still a part of an organization too. What you say if you talk about that organization is involved with, and the other thing is sort of like so like for both of us, it's not immediately apparent, and we don't advertise, and we aren't very well known, so we can kind of say whatever we want, and it's kind of
Exactly.
okay, right? But when you're somebody like Jeffrey Hinton, everyone knows not only you, but also what organization you work for,
Yeah.
right? And so anything you say is like, "Oh, this is what Google thinks."
You're a mouthpiece whether or not you want to be.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like being a CEO. Like,
Mhm.
sometimes you have to, like, train as a CEO so that, like, you don't say things that suddenly have this huge amount of weight, like you're talking about something and you're like, "Oh, like, yeah, we kinda dropped the ball on this thing, like, who worked on that?" And then
Stocks
it's
drop.
like yeah, it's like, like, yeah, stocks drop or, like, this person, like, gets fired at the company because you kinda made a joke, and it was a
Offhand
joke
remarks. Yeah.
too, but, like,
Yeah.
you're just like, "Oh, crap," you know? So, it's, he was in that sort of situation. Um, I think the coolest thing that he talked about was how, at least I read the MIT interview. I don't know if that's one
Mm.
you read as well, but uh, the the or technology review by MIT. Yeah. The thing that he talked about was basically they went to try and understand sort of how biological learning happens. They replicated that with AI, like machine learning capabilities, and they didn't just create something similar; they created something better. Is sort of his belief,
Mm.
and that's what's scary here is that
Yeah.
it's a jump, and that it can learn faster than you know than we can, right?
Yeah. And he's not even saying that it's better right now in all ways than a human
Hmm.
being, but he's like
Hmm.
the core base tools that we are building
Hmm.
can scale and grow and still have quite a bit of a runway that he sees
Hmm.
in terms of how it can grow. And he's
Hmm.
afraid for a variety. He's not afraid, maybe it's not what to use, but he's concerned. Let's say for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
Number one, he's concerned about jobs and the process of human labor. He's like, I don't think we have a good framework to handle the disruption. Even if we don't necessarily lose jobs in terms of numbers, we will lose jobs in terms of like shifting from being technical writer for SEO blog websites to something
Hmm.
else.
Hmm.
And that disruption is going to be very hectic for a while, and it will
Hmm.
probably increase for a while. And he wants to make sure that we're all aware of that and talking about it and getting out ahead of
Hmm.
it. He's also very kind of cautious about the fact that humans and how we think about our self worth is going to be challenged.
Hmm.
He's also challenged about like the more technical risk specific issues. And we mentioned it before here and there, but there are people out there. Anthropic is a good company to point to who feel strongly about this and they want to build AI off the bat that is. Anthropic recently had their constitutionally aware kind of
Hmm.
models where they have a deep sort of like Asimov's laws type system
Hmm.
where Asimov, if you don't know, is a sci-fi writer who wrote the Three Laws of Robotics, which are very famous and known in lots of sci-fi movies. I,
Hmm.
Robot, for example, with Will Smith, talks about it. where and also the name of his book, I Robot. That you kind of try to create these rules for AI that says first do no harm, more or less, and in action don't harm others and don't harm yourself, and all these sorts of
Mhm.
things. And his whole story about those three laws actually are like how it's never works because there's always a loophole that
Mhm.
if they get through, we're in trouble.
Mhm.
That's to that degree. Regardless, though, there are people out there who are working. Anthropic was one of them. Other groups out there who are very large and who are trying to create safety first conscious models.
Mhm.
And he strongly about that as well too. That we need to
Mhm.
be doing that. And he's like, there needs to be government oversight. There needs to be government insight. There recently was a big congressional hearing with Sam
Mhm.
Altman, some person from IBM, I forget her name, and Gary
Mhm.
Marcus, who is an interesting character.
Mhm.
I can have a whole podcast about him. He's Canadian too, actually. A lot of Canadians in the space.
Mhm.
Um, and he's a well-known critic. Critic? I don't know what to call him anymore because he used to
Mhm.
criticize AI before for a long time. Language models as not being able to do all these things. Like they can't do any of
Mhm.
these things. They're built in a way that's not they can't do them. But now it's more like, okay, they're doing a lot of things and I don't like it. Let's talk about that. Let's get ahead of it. Let's shut it down. Let's slow it down. Put some restrictions.
Mhm.
I don't think he's fully kind of communicating his thoughts about that shift or what have you. But at the very least,
Mhm.
he's a well-known critic of AI and the industry, and he
Mhm.
tries really hard to kind of insert himself in this discussion, which is it's fine.
Mhm.
He has lots to say that's valuable,
Mhm.
and I think that to some degree it is happening. What Geoffrey Hinton wants. We are
Yeah.
hearing governments talking about this more and more now.
Mhm.
We are seeing people, discuss the
Mhm.
ramifications of your ChatGPTs and jobs
Mhm.
potentially. We're getting more.
Did you see the EU thing where they're talking about banning like the open use of language models that aren't like basically regulated and in just the right ways that the EU agrees on?
Yeah, and
Mhm.
and people feel very conflicted about that and very challenged
Mhm.
about that. To
Mhm.
some degree, I get it. You don't want a language model that's like able to go out there and spew hateful content and be duplicated,
Mhm.
so there could be millions of bots out there on your Reddit, on your Twitter, on your Instagram, generating content.
Mhm.
Imagine there's a million bots out there that can be generating, individually unique looking, attractive women
Mhm.
who say Russia's the best or whomever, right?
Mhm.
That could have potentially an impact on society at large.
Mhm.
And this is like, that's kind of the elephant in the room. That's what they're afraid of. They're afraid
Mhm.
of, other state actors creating systems
Mhm.
that can do this sort of thing,
Mhm.
or individuals in some cases.
Mhm.
But at the same time, the idea of having a state be like, this is what's okay for it to talk about, and this is not okay
Mhm.
for it to talk about,
Mhm.
is its own challenge. And I think that will fly more in the UK and EU in general,
Mhm.
and less so in places like the US.
Mhm.
Canada somewhere in the middle, I feel like.
Mhm.
It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. And I get why people want that, but I also
Mhm.
don't think it's going to be possible for a lot of
Mhm.
reasons because open source.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's also the EU. Reading like this Chakri article on this, it's basically also the EU telling the US that it needs to police companies within the US with these massive fines, sort of breaking sovereignty to some
Mhm.
degree on like the US ability to like control its own borders. Globalization and all these other things have already kind of like infringed on that, but it's an interesting stepping stone, and we already kind of saw it with if you think about cookies and GDPR compliance and stuff like that. That has been kind of like fully adopted across the board when it comes to web development.
And that's very
Uh,
controversial too, because I think,
mhm.
ironically, I think now nobody cares about cookies at all. I think
Yeah,
that's all every single time. And like, I don't care about this. I don't want to see this every single time I go to a website. Um,
exactly. Yeah.
Regardless,
So,
yeah.
but yeah, I think that gives us a pretty good gambit of some of the ethical places. I think there's no way we could possibly cover all
God,
the
no.
ethical space, but these are the things I think that were top of mind.
Yeah. Here's my final thought on this. I think that a lot of people are starting to now grapple with these questions for the
Mhm.
first time. I grew up reading sci-fi all the time, and so I love Star Trek. All the questions about like I think about all the episodes of like TNG. The Next Generation is a series of Star Trek that has like Patrick Stewart as the captain. They had a robot called Data on there, and Data was a interesting character where he kind of always tried to talk about this idea of he was a kind of reflection of this discussion that we're having right now about our AI models able to represent humanity in the right
Mhm.
ways. Can they do certain things that are human? And if it could, what would that mean for us as
Mhm.
people? And grappling with that has always been part of like the nature of sci-fi. So I've been in this space to some degree for a long time, but I think not everybody likes sci-fi. It's not a thing for everybody, and that's fair. But I think what's happening now is sci-fi is becoming just sci, and people it's impacting their lives.
Mhm.
If you're a writer, if you're an artist, if you're accountant, if you're who knows what,
Mhm.
increasingly your life is going to be impacted by this stuff. And
Mhm.
so that's ethical discussions are going to be more and more relevant. And I appreciate why it's coming up. And I don't have the answers.
Mhm.
All I want to do though is get people's juices flowing, so to speak.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
what.
And maybe a little bit less sci-fi focused on zombie apocalypse and like end of the world, and maybe some ideas of like what could we do going forward.
Yeah, exactly. Even
Yeah.
even in like the boring questions are probably the most relevant to us.
Mm.
Not the utopia, not the dystopia, but somewhere in
Mhm.
the middle where it's like,
Mhm.
well, what are we gonna do about the nature of art in
Mhm.
a world in which people's jobs are to create pictures for you?
Mhm.
Well, relevant, interesting stuff to be had in that regard and to talk about that. And I think that we will be contesting with this and fighting it, grappling it for years to come. So
Awesome.
we'll talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Awesome. Definitely a little longer than normal, but hey, had a lot of good stuff to talk about.
It was
So
a great talk.
thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for tuning in, everybody, and we'll be back again hopefully shortly. So
Peace.
awesome. See ya.